Can everyone hear me? Yes? Okay, great. As John said, I'm Samantha Wilcoxson, and I write historical fiction. And I actually really love historical fun facts, so that's what I'm going to start with today. And that April 14th was James's 237th birthday. So happy birthday, James. As many of you will already know, James is the son of Alexander Hamilton and Elizabeth Schuyler. He was born in the year of the Constitutional Convention, 1788, and became a keen observer of history throughout his 90 years. This first image is a portrait held by a descendant of James's, Helen Hamilton Spaulding, and she very kindly shared a photo of this portrait with me and also gave her permission for it to be used on my book cover. So I'm very grateful to her for that and really was excited to get this picture because after doing some research and looking for images of James, I had only found a couple, which you will see in this presentation, but this one was quite a bit nicer and I was really happy to receive it. I became interested in James Alexander Hamilton when I was actually writing my previous book called Women of the American Revolution. And that book is kind of a series of mini biographies. Each chapter is about a different woman, and one of those was Elizabeth Schuyler. So while I was looking for information about her, I discovered that in 1869, James had published a memoir of sorts called Reminiscences of James A. Hamilton, or Men and Events at Home and Abroad During 3/4 of a Century. We don't really name books like that anymore, thankfully. So when I found this book, it was a great place to find a few memories about Eliza that I hadn't necessarily found anywhere else. So I was really excited to find that. But as I read more, I wonder why has nobody written about James? Because I just found that he was a really interesting guy, and he was revealed as someone who never really strove for power for himself, but had advised presidents from Andrew Jackson to Abraham Lincoln, and had quite a few personal adventures along the way. His Reminiscences is more of a collection of correspondence and his own observations on events than a true autobiography, so I set out to collect more personal information about him and to put his observations in a meaningful context for modern readers. I'm going to skip ahead a bit chronologically because, as John already pointed out, the exciting thing today is that we are here on James Hamilton's estate. And this picture that I took when I was here a couple years ago doing some research, and Amy gave me a lovely tour of the home. So I'm excited to be here again and share some of the history of James and the estate specifically, and since before it became part of Columbia University. Nevis is, of course, named after the small Caribbean island upon which Alexander Hamilton was born, which, John is correct, they pronounce there Nevis, and here it's Nevis. That's okay. James was passionate about honoring his father's name. It was why he always included his middle initial in his signature. And just another little fun fact side note, that was how I was able to identify a quote misattributed to our James Hamilton in a nonfiction book I was reading because I didn't think it sounded like him. So I looked up the letter in the Library of Congress, and it was signed by James Hamilton Jr. of South Carolina, not James A. Hamilton of New York. And he always signed it that way, never left out the A. So, and another thing he did to his father was seek out meetings with men like John Quincy Adams and Albert Gallatin seeking testimony about his father, and it's why he named his family estate after an obscure place that most people had never heard of. Nevis was built in 1835, and James started construction on it within a year of his mother selling Hamilton Grange. So maybe part of losing that boyhood home inspired him to build something for the next generation. Nevis originally had views of the Hudson, which I noticed today you can actually see through the trees a little bit, but in the summer you can't. And teasing James about the lack of vegetation on the property, friend and neighbor Washington Irving had suggested a single tree hall for the estate. but James went with Nevis. James built the fine structure that we see today, minus the wings that were added later, and it was home to family heirlooms as well as James's 5 children. Gifts from George Washington to his parents, including a Gilbert Stuart painting and a silver tankard, were held here during James's lifetime. And his nephew, another Alexandrian, later wrote that it was always a bright and happy home. As testimony of the closeness of the Hamilton family, records show James transferring portions of the land here to 2 of his daughters after they were married so that they could have cottages on the Nevis grounds. After James's death, the home was inherited by his son, another Alexander Hamilton. Only later was the estate donated to Columbia University to become the Nevis Laboratories that we see today, which I should have said this already, but I will not be taking any physics questions in case you were wondering. So now that we've recognized where we are, we can go back to the beginning. Child, the 3rd son of Alexander and Eliza Hamilton. Although James doesn't record many personal accounts in his reminiscences, he does include a few memories of. So just to talk about this image real quickly, in the background you can maybe see Hamilton Grange faintly there, and from the Caribbean. And this portrait of Eliza I'll talk about a little bit more, and maybe some of you guys already know the background of the story, but Ralph Earl was actually imprisoned for indebtedness. And so Alexander and Eliza thought that it would be a good idea to help him out and have her sit for this portrait to help him earn some money, and to also some other people to go and sit for so that he could work his way out of debt and earn his freedom. So I just think that that's a great story that shows what kind of woman Eliza was, that she was always doing things to help out others. Reminiscences, James wrote about a loving and devoted father who made an 8-mile commute into the city each 2-wheeled cart so that he could be home with his family. He wrote about his father singing and playing piano with his sister Angelica. And he wrote that his father was always affectionate and confiding and encouraged those characteristics in others. He also shared a memory from his time as a student at Columbia. Alexander had sent James a thesis on discretion with a note that said, "You may need it." Which is ironic that Alexander Hamilton said that. But anyway, when sharing this in his reminiscences, James humbly adds, "The reader may perhaps say that in attempting to write these reminiscences, I have shown that the admonition was thrown away." James wrote just as fondly about his mother, remembering her cutting and buttering bread for the children as they recited their lessons. Since Eliza outlived Alexander by half a century, James also shares memories of her as an energetic and philanthropic widow, often wearing herself out and running herself out of money in service to others. There's at least one letter in his reminiscences where she's thanking him for the money he has sent her. James was with Eliza at her deathbed in 1854, where she embraced him affectionately and said, "God bless you, you have been a good son." In this image, this is one of the other pictures of James I was able to find. This is a miniature signed by Amy Tybalt. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. And it was done about the same time as James built Nevis. So he was in his late 40s at this point. And the letter in the background is actually a letter written by James, which honestly I've mostly included, so you will sympathize with the hours I've spent trying to interpret James's handwriting. And the zoomed in portion is that signature where he always includes that A in his signature. Even when he initials something, it's always J-A-H. Eliza Hamilton was obsessed with preserving and honoring her husband's legacy after he was killed in a duel with Aaron Burr in 1804. She passed on this need to protect the Hamilton name to her sons. John Church Hamilton, the next younger son after James, collected their father's papers and wrote an extensive biography of Alexander at Eliza's request. And James was well known enough for collecting stories and testimony about his father that it's not uncommon to find references to Alexander in his correspondence decades after his father's death. One of the last pamphlets that James wrote was in 1870, and it was a defense of his father's time as Treasury, written in response to posthumous accusations made by Martin Van Buren that were published by his sons. So no, they never got over it. Long before that, an issue that cropped up for James to deal with was the authorship of George Washington's farewell address. Today, it is well known and accepted that Alexander Hamilton assisted with the writing of this address that was written to encourage future peaceful transfers of power like the one Washington planned to make when he stepped down after his 2 terms as president. The address, which was written rather than speech, reassures friends and fellow citizens that the Republic is strong enough for unity and appreciation for the differences between regions and states. And after Alexander Hamilton's death, many people were as eager to deny as Eliza was to publicize it. Therefore, it fell to James to locate documentation that would prove it. Months of letters written and visits to Washington did not really produce the results he was looking for, and he ended up having to file a lawsuit to receive some of the letters written by his own father. In the end, Hamilton's co-authorship was not really widely accepted until shortly before the Civil War, when it no longer really mattered. And today, the letters back and forth between them are actually part of the Alexander Hamilton papers, and they very clearly have them writing back and forth about, should we change this? What do you want to say here? So in case you were wondering, yes, Alexander Hamilton did really help with the Washington's farewell address. During James's appointment as secretary, we'll talk about in just a moment, James found the opportunity to discuss a rumor about his father with John Quincy Adams. Adams was by that time a former serving in the House of Representatives. And though they were both heirs of founders, John Quincy was a bit older than James. And James asked him what he remembered rumors regarding attempts to establish a Northern Confederacy that hoped to secede in response to President Jefferson's embargo on Great Britain. Some people had accused Alexander Hamilton of taking the part of the secessionists, something that James really doubted, knowing how his father felt about the country. John Quincy was able to reassure James that, quote, "Your father's purpose was to dissuade the parties concerned from the undertaking and to prevail upon them to abandon it." Around this same time, James also encountered Albert Gallatin, who succeeded his father as Treasury Secretary. He admitted that Jefferson had tasked him with finding mistakes and frauds committed by Hamilton. But what he found was, quote, "the most perfect system ever found. Hamilton made no blunders, committed no frauds, he did nothing wrong." And I have to imagine that James was much more excited to get this testimony than Jefferson was. It was testimony that James was happy to repeat, defending the national bank system in one of the key disagreements he had with President Andrew Jackson. On to James's time as Secretary of State, and this image is a painting of the White House and South Grounds in 1827, so it is just a couple of years before James would have been there to serve as Secretary of State, and we can see the changes that have happened in Washington, D.C. in the last 200 years. James Hamilton was actually not a supporter of Andrew Jackson in the elections of 1824 and 1828, but it is this president who called upon James's talents the most and the one his name has become most connected with. They first met when James was selected to represent the city of New York in a celebration honoring General Jackson in New Orleans shortly before the beginning of his presidency. James went traveling the farthest west he ever would during his lifetime when he visited the Hermitage in Tennessee and then traveled down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. During the celebration, James gave a speech honoring Jackson on behalf of the city of New York, And then, in a service that would become a habit, he also wrote Jackson's response. The experience clearly left an impression on Jackson because when Martin Van Buren could not immediately be in Washington, James was chosen to be Secretary of State in his temporary stead. This only lasted about a month, but his position didn't really end then. Van Buren and Hamilton had been friends since their days as young lawyers together, so Van Buren trusted Hamilton not to usurp the position permanently. And if you know anything about Martin Van Buren, you'll know that's saying something, because the man knew a lot about political maneuvering. Just as his father had assisted President Washington, one of James's first duties in Washington was to amend Jackson's inaugural address. He wrote that, quote, "Had it gone forth as it first stood, it would have been absolutely disgraceful." Jackson was so pleased with James's work as temporary Secretary of State that he appointed him District Attorney of Southern New York, an appointment that Van Buren was not pleased that was made in perhaps the first crack in their friendship. Around the same time, Van Buren had recommended James for a judgeship, so I don't know if that was just not a piece of his political maneuvering to have him district attorney, but he did write that he strongly disagreed with the appointment. Both Jackson and Van Buren kept James in Washington far beyond his time as Secretary of State, and some, including John Quincy Adams, thought that Jackson would make James an Undersecretary of State to keep him there. And unfortunately, I was able to find where John Quincy wrote this, that people believed it was going to happen, but I was not able to find anything saying why it did not. So James became District Attorney of Southern New York instead. And this image is Broadway in 1819, or a little over a decade before James's appointment as District Attorney of Southern New York. So again, a few changes made in the intervening years. James's time as District Attorney was truly split between those duties and continuing to advise Jackson through both correspondence and frequent visits to Washington. He worked on cases that he felt were significant enough to include in his reminiscences. In one, James was forced to select one person among a group of known pirates to testify against the others. One life would be saved through his evidence proving the other's guilt. He selected a young man of 16 in the hopes that he would turn his life around if given a second chance. But James felt the weight of this responsibility when he wrote, "To have the life or death of a human being in one's hands was the most painful condition." In the second case he wrote about, he worked on behalf of the US government and also the royal family of Orange in a case where stolen jewels were found being smuggled into New York. The collector of the Port of New York, Samuel Swartout, attempted to claim half the value of the jewels, as was standard for smuggled goods. But James saw them return to their rightful owner after months of debate and legalities and involvement by several of Jackson's cabinet members. James joined Buren in encouraging Jackson to remove Swartout from the position as collector of the Port of New York for his obvious fraudulent activities. Unfortunately, Jackson refused, and Swartout eventually embezzled over $1 million in one of the largest instances of early American fraud. James ended up resigning his district attorney position when advising Jackson on the national bank issue absorbed too much of his time. Some historians have assumed that James supported Jackson in dissolving the Second National Bank, but a review of their correspondence proves that James encouraged reforms but not disestablishment. He warned of the financial panic that would and did occur. He recorded in his reminiscences, quote, "These efforts to enlighten the president, made at his request, were wholly unavailing. He had determined before he came to Washington to destroy the Bank of the United States, and the result was a most disastrous inflation of the currency, reckless speculation, and the extended ruin of 1837. Now I'm going to back up one more time so that we can talk about James's family, which of course was growing concurrently to all these historical political events. So not very visible in the background of this one is actually a view of the Hudson, but yeah, you can't really see that. But what's more important is the portrait of James's wife, Mary, and that's the partner portrait to the one on my first slide. So done around 1835 of Mary Morris. I was not able to find images of two of their daughters, Elizabeth and Angelica. That's the oldest and youngest daughters. I was able to find a portrait of Alexander, one of the several people who went by Alexander Hamilton II at times. So James had a brother, a nephew, and a son who all sometimes signed their name as Alexander Hamilton II, which is really fun for people trying to research history. And especially in the case of his son and nephew, who were also almost precisely the same age. So I understand wanting to keep the Alexander name in the family for sure, but it gets confusing. And then also after Alexander is their other daughters, Frances and Mary. I'll talk a little bit more about each of them. James married Mary Morris in 1810 at a young enough age to indicate that personal affection was a big part of the match. Together they had a child every year or two for about the next decade, having a son and 4 daughters by the end of 1819. The entire family was close, as is indicated by their personal letters and how much time they spent together, especially here at Nevis after James's children were adults. Alexander would go on to fight in the Civil War and become president of the Library in New York City, which is where this portrait hangs. Mary became one of the first co-regents of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which still owns and manages Mount Vernon, and who left behind a great record of correspondence between her and her father, especially during his European travels, also helped with before she died of cancer during the war. Daughters Elizabeth and Frances married at around age 20. Elizabeth married George Lee Schuyler, therefore she became Elizabeth Hamilton Schuyler, not to be confused with her grandmother, Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. Well into adulthood, Alexander refers to James in his letters as my dear papa, and his sisters, when he writes to George Lee Schuyler, as our dear girls. It is perhaps no surprise, then, that 6 years after Elizabeth died, that George married Mary. That's why they're buried between the two sisters in the James Hamilton family plot at Sleepy Hollow. One of the interesting and surprising things I learned about James Hamilton was that he helped fight New York's Great Fire of 1835. It's not only an exciting story, but it's also one of the few instances in his reminiscences where his personality really shines through. So that was why I wanted to share it with you today. This image is actually an aftermath of the fire, flames from the fire. James was staying at the City Hotel when he was roused during the night of December 16th. He was told of a raging fire and encouraged to attempt to save his father in the Merchants Exchange. James hurriedly left with this goal in mind. The statue had been recently sculpted by Robert Ball Hughes and Alexander in toga, as was a popular way to honor American founding fathers at that time. With help from men from the Navy Yard, James approached the Merchants Exchange, but was forced to watch as the domed ceiling crashed in and yard. Realizing that much more was at stake, James looked to see where else he might help, and seeing that the fire was raging and that the excessively cold temperatures were freezing the water in the hydrants, he suggested making a fire break, and since it's to do it, that he would light the first fuse. So they did. They selected buildings to create a fire break, and James goes into actually an uncharacteristic amount of detail regarding the reminiscences. But my favorite part is when he recorded that they had set a barrel under a structure, lit the fuse, and he was just kind of strolling away from this lit fuse when people started yelling at him to run. And he writes in his reminiscences, "This was a little affectation of fear on my part, well knowing that it could not burn down to the train before I could get well away." So in my mind, that's like James's Mission Impossible moment with explosions going off behind him. So have to have imagination as a writer. Other James adventures surprised to discover, and this one's really my favorite, is that he was a crew member in the regatta that would become known as America's Cup. George Lee Schuyler, his son-in-law, was one of the owners of the schooner America that was invited to participate in the Royal Yacht Squadron race, but he was unable to travel, so he asked his father-in-law to go. Great Britain at this time had a reputation for sailing, while the U.S. had one yacht club, the New Club, that George Schuyler was one of the co-founders. We're going to embarrass ourselves. But Schuyler and the other owners were confident in American ingenuity and wanted to put it to the test. James wrote the morning of August 22nd, 1851, that the morning was bright, the wind very light. The 16 ships set off, breaking away like a field of racehorses. The Yankee vessel, seeming to be excited by the responsibility, rushed to the lead in beautiful style. Queen Victoria was in attendance at this race, and when she asked who was in first, she was informed, the America. When she asked which is second, she was told, Majesty is no second. They were all too far behind. When she decided to personally congratulate the winners, James met the Queen and joined the party, giving her a tour of the ship. He reported it as a friendly visit with, quote, those forms generally observed in the presence of Majesty entirely done away. And as you've probably guessed, that's what this image is. That is Queen Victoria, and this is the third and final portrait I have that includes James, and he is the older, slender man all the way to the left. The America performed so well and so unexpectedly that the regatta has retained its name to this day in the America's Cup. This was just one of several trips that James took to Europe, where he made copious international connections and observations. On one trip, he helped George Washington Lafayette draft a new French Constitution. And he mentions on several of his visits, people asking him about the institution of slavery in the United States. And he honestly records his responses. For years, James believed, as many early Americans did, that slavery was a state issue that could not be impacted by federal law. And to me, it's an indication of James's integrity that writing of these events decades later and publishing the book after the Civil War, that he confesses to his earlier ideas and thoughts rather than claiming to have always been a staunch abolitionist. When James supported Jackson against South Carolina during the nullification crisis of the 1830s, he likely had no idea that the issue of secession would rise again, and this time in a much more violent and serious form. When looking back on history, it's really easy to say this war happened from 1861 to 1865 without talking about the truth of how long animosity and problems had been building. As I've already touched upon, James evolved from believing that slavery was wrong, but the federal government couldn't really do anything about it, to supporting the Free Soil Party was kind of his next step, and they believed in not expanding slavery to new Western territories, but that it also could not be touched in the South. And then in the end, he would vigorously oppose slavery. His journey was not unique in that era of America, or this fight against slavery might never have been won. Possibly even more significant to James than the obvious human rights issue was the constitutional issues involved. He was a lawyer. He wrote and spoke tirelessly during the 1850s in an attempt to encourage civil discourse and to find common ground to preserve the Union, calling it holy work to arrest this fell spirit of disunion. But calmer heads did not prevail. In 1856, Charles Sumner was brutally caned in the halls of Congress for speaking against slavery. And that's what this image is Senator Sumner being beaten in the halls of the Senate. And his beating was worse even than it might have been, because being a tall man, his legs were trapped under his desk. So he couldn't get away from his assailant. And making things worse, the people watching were either cheering this on or were too afraid to stand up for Sumner and intervene. Southerners celebrated the violence, but James was much pained by the events, not least because Sumner was a personal friend of his, but also because he considered it an attack on the Senate and on the freedom of debate. Concerned about the violence and lack of respect for free speech, James supported John Fremont in the election of 1856, believing, quote, the success of Mr. Buchanan would be more to be deplored than that of either of the other candidates. I cannot express in terms too strong my contempt for the spirit of unmanly compliance which has induced him to lay down his identity to become the inanimate representative of a party platform. That platform was, of course, Southern slavery. Fremont was a candidate of the Free Soil Party. He had the timeless disadvantage of being too moderate, called anti-slavery by Southerners and pro-slavery by abolitionists. James had hoped that a moderate candidate could bring peace, but this was not to be, and James worried, even back in 1856, he wrote that they would, quote, plunge us into civil war. Another event that inspired James to speak up about this time is the Dred Scott decision of 1857. In the Supreme Court decision, Chief Justice Roger Taney claimed that rights under the Constitution did not extend to black people, free or enslaved, and he denied the legality of black citizenship. James wrote a heated response to this case, calling Taney's argument wholly groundless. He quoted from the Constitution, as well as used the works of historians and philosophers, and of course his father, in writing his counter-argument to what he called judicial perversion. The election of 1860 remains unique in our country's history due to its regional breakdown, where the same candidates were not even on the ballots in the North and the South. When Lincoln, the first Republican president, was elected, Charles Francis Adams, a son of John Quincy, wrote, quote, the Great Revolution has actually taken place. The country has once and for all thrown off the domination of the slaveholders, and immediate states began to secede. In James's reminiscences, he refers to the Civil War as the most interesting period of my life, the rebellion. He had no doubt that secession was treason and that it removed Southerners' protections under the Constitution. This was, of course, most significant in the issue of slavery. James no longer believed that slaveholders had constitutionally protected state rights, and he stated, I was sternly opposed to slavery because I knew it to be a great crime and a great evil to the oppressor as well as the oppressed. It was well understood that slavery should not be interfered with directly by the free states. I therefore did not permit myself to become an abolitionist. As soon, however, as the slave states threw off their allegiance, freed from my constitutional obligations, I became a most determined abolitionist. James and his brother John began to speak and write boldly against what they called the slave power that had long held unbalanced political strength through the poorly conceived Three-Fifths Compromise. Still, James was also concerned with holding together the country that his father had helped build, and he wrote to Southern statesmen in the hope that some of them might see reason. That failing, he wrote President Buchanan to encourage quick action in fortifying federal holdings in the South, including Fort Moultrie and Fort Sumter. He even offered to fund and lead a force of 400 volunteers himself. He was greatly disappointed when General Winfield Scott replied that there was no need for that sort of action. Buchanan refused any action, leaving the coming war to his successor. After shots were fired at Fort Sumter, James wrote to General Winfield Scott again, and I'm going to read you this letter. Permit me to ask if a hale man of 73 years of age can be useful in any way that you will command my services, to cut off the remnant of an inglorious life by a glorious death in the service of our country, to which my ancestors of 2 generations devoted their best services, ought not be considered as an event to be avoided. Scott did not put James in uniform, but he was invited to join a committee to advise the new president. When he met Abraham Lincoln, James asked, quote, whether he intended to give as well as receive blows in order that my fellow citizens of New York might understand what their duty was and be prepared to perform it. He also provided Lincoln with a plan of military operation that he had prepared, but his true contribution ended up being advising the new Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, throughout the war. Both James and Chase understood that healthy finances would help the Union war, as would freeing the enslaved and recruiting them to help in the fight for freedom. They formed a fast friendship that benefited the Union in ways we rarely have the opportunity to hear about, because most Civil War histories do not mention James Alexander Hamilton. As Northerners became war-weary, James learned that the county of Westchester was experiencing a shortage of volunteers. He encouraged his neighbors to enlist and, quote, crush the barbarous hordes fighting to establish an aristocracy founded upon slavery, and thus vindicate the Constitution and the Union. James was also asked to provide Lincoln with a draft of an Emancipation Proclamation in one of his final acts of presidential advisement. So this image is the book cover that I was telling you about using that portrait, and I'm really pleased with what Pen and Sword did with it. You can partially see James's signature up there as well. And the background image of this slide is actually the America, so you can get a better view of that as well. Years. He did not record how tragic it was that Lincoln was assassinated just when peace was at hand, or what he thought of Reconstruction. And be willing to work for their old masters, and if they should be, by what course of legislation can their freedom be? This, as we know, would be a struggle in the years to come, as James's generation, like the previous one, James's son and nephew, those two Alexander Hamiltons, both survived their service in the war, but as I said, his daughter Elizabeth died of cancer in Washington while she was volunteering for the Sanitary Commission alongside her daughter, Louisa Lee Schuyler. During the post-war years, James lost his daughter, Angelica, and his wife of almost 60 years, Mary. But he must have been somewhat comforted by that marriage between his daughter, Mary, and the son-in-law he was so close to, George Lee Schuyler. James died at Nevis on September 24th, 1878, at age 90, survived by two of his brothers, his son and one daughter, Frances, as well as 4 grandchildren. Even James' obituary mentions his devotion to his father's legacy. It notes that James published in 1870 Hamilton's conduct as a Secretary of the Treasury vindicated, in which considerable documentary evidence of importance is adduced in defense of his father's financial policy. It also said of James, on a more personal note, that those who knew him will miss an old man's picturesque and rambling reminiscences of society and politics in old times. He had seen President Washington and knew all the mythology of the heroes of the Revolution by heart. James is buried at Sleepy Hollow alongside his wife, his son, 3 of his daughters, George Lee Schuyler, and the 3 Schuyler grandchildren. I hope you've enjoyed this introduction to James Alexander Hamilton, and if you would like to know more, maybe you'll consider my biography. I do have copies available for sale here tonight, and I can sign them for you, but especially I want to thank you all for having me here in this beautiful place surrounded by his history.